Every man carries wounds that time cannot heal. For Clay Barlow, a weathered rancher in the dusty frontier town of 1880s Montana, those wounds run deeper than most. A lost daughter, a buried past as a gunslinger, and a heart hardened by years of bitter solitude. Clay sat on his porch, staring at a cracked daguerreotype of his wife Sarah and daughter Emily, both taken by fever 5 winters past. The photograph trembled in his calloused hands as he traced Emily's face with his thumb. She would have been 16 now, probably arguing with him about everything under the sun, when an orphaned black girl named Ella arrives with a wagon train, bold and fearless. She claims she can ride horses better than any man alive. Clay scoffs at her bold audacity and issues a cruel dare. Ride Diablo, his untamed mustang, and he'll adopt her himself. To everyone's shock, she does it. Bareback, wild, and completely unafraid. But can this unlikely bond between two outcasts heal wounds that have festered for decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clay Barlow's days began before the sun painted the Montana sky pink. The routine never varied. Boots on weathered floorboards, coffee black as midnight, and the slow walk to the barn where his remaining horses waited for their morning feed. The ranch that once bustled with activity now felt hollow, like an echo of better times. He moved through the morning chores with mechanical precision, each task a distraction from the silence that pressed against his ears. 3 horses remained from what had once been a thriving operation. Old Blue, a steady gelding, Copper, a mare with kind eyes, and Diablo, the wild mustang he'd captured 2 years back, but never managed to break. Diablo paced his corral like a caged storm, muscles rippling beneath his midnight coat, eyes flashing with untamed defiance. The town of Clearwater sat 2 miles down, a dusty road that wound between rolling hills, dotted with sage and scattered pines. Clay made the journey twice a week for supplies, his presence stirring whispers and respectful nods from folks who remembered when his name carried different weight. They called him Mr. Barlow now, with careful politeness, but Clay remembered when they'd called him other things, some with fear, some with admiration, most with a mixture of both. In the top drawer of his bedroom dresser, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay his Colt .45. The weight of it felt familiar in his palm when he cleaned it monthly, muscle memory guiding his fingers across the worn grip. He'd carved 23 notches in that grip during his years as a gunslinger, each one representing a man who'd drawn against him and lost. 23 souls who'd met their maker because they'd been foolish enough to test Clay Barlow's speed. Those days felt like another lifetime now. After Sarah's death, he'd hung up his guns and tried to build something different, a life of honest work and quiet mornings. But the past had a way of clinging to a man's reputation like dust to his boots. Even now, 5 years after his last gunfight, merchants spoke carefully around him, and troublemakers gave him a wide berth. Doc Henderson was one of the few people in Clearwater who treated Clay like a normal man. The old physician had delivered Emily and tended to Sarah during her final illness. His weathered hands had closed Sarah's eyes when the fever finally claimed her, and he'd stood beside Clay at 2 gravesites when the Montana earth swallowed his family whole. "Clay, you're looking thin," Doc said one Tuesday morning when Clay stopped by for liniment. "When's the last time you had a proper meal? Something that didn't come from a can?" Clay shrugged, counting out coins for his purchase. "I eat plenty. Coffee and hardtack don't constitute plenty." Doc's gray eyes studied Clay with the intensity of a man accustomed to reading symptoms. "Sarah wouldn't want you wasting away out." And there, the mention of his wife's name hit like a physical blow, but Clay's expression remained neutral. "Sarah's gone, Doc. What she'd want doesn't matter anymore, doesn't it?" Doc leaned against his counter, arms crossed. "Seems to me a woman who loved you for 15 years might have some opinions about how you're choosing to honor her memory." Clay pocketed the liniment and headed for the door. I'll see you next week. Sheriff Mills occupied a different category in Clay's limited social circle. Tom Mills had been a Green deputy when Clay's reputation was at its peak, and he'd watched from the sidelines as Clay carved his legend across 3 territories. Now, with silver threading his mustache and lines deepening around his eyes, Mills maintained a professional respect tinged with wariness. "Any trouble out your way?" Mills asked when their paths crossed outside the general store. "Nothing I can't handle." "I know that, Clay. Doesn't stop me from asking." Mills adjusted his badge, a nervous habit Clay had noticed developing over the years. "Had some talk about land buyers sniffing around the valley, offering good money. For ranches. They can offer all they want. My land isn't for sale. Figured as much. Just thought you should know they're persistent folks, the kind who don't take no for an answer easily." Clay's hand moved instinctively toward where his gun belt used to hang, then dropped to his side. "I appreciate the warning." The saloon keeper, Martha, represented another facet of Clearwater's complex relationship with Clay's past. She'd run the 3 Aces for 20 years, serving drinks to cowboys, drifters, and the occasional gunslinger passing through town. During Clay's active years, she'd watched him back down more than one challenger with nothing but a cold stare and a reputation that preceded him like a shadow. "Clay Barlow," she called out when he passed her establishment. "You look like a man who could use a drink and some conversation." "Don't drink anymore, Martha. You know that. I know what you tell people. Doesn't mean I believe it." She wiped her hands on her apron, studying him with the keen eye of someone who'd seen too many broken men try to drown their sorrows. "Sarah never had a problem with you taking an occasional whiskey. Sarah never saw what whiskey could make a man do with a gun in his hand." Martha nodded slowly. "Fair point, but there's a difference between drowning and just getting your feet wet now and then." Clay touched his hat brim. "Maybe so, but I can't afford to find out where that line is." The ranch house where Clay had built his life with Sarah felt enormous and empty in the evenings. Every room held memories that both comforted and tortured him. Emily's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it the morning she took sick. Quilt folded at the foot of her bed, books stacked on her nightstand, her favorite dress hanging in the wardrobe. Sarah's sewing basket still sat beside her chair in the parlor, needle and thread, waiting for hands that would never return. Clay often found himself standing in the doorway of Emily's room, remembering her laughter echoing through the house. She'd been fearless around horses, just like her mother, with an intuitive understanding of what the animals needed. At 11, she could gentle a skittish colt better than most grown men, her small hands moving with Sarah's same patient confidence. "She'll be a fine horsewoman someday," Sarah had said, watching Emily work with a young mare. "Better than either of us, I think." But someday had never come. The fever had taken them both in the space of 2 weeks, leaving Clay alone, with nothing but ghosts and guilt. He'd been in Billings when the sickness started, settling a dispute that couldn't wait. By the time he'd returned, Doc Henderson's grim expression had told him everything he needed to know before the man even opened his mouth. The nights were hardest. Clay would sit on his porch, listening to coyotes sing their lonesome songs to the Montana stars, feeling the weight of silence pressed down like a heavy blanket. Sometimes he'd take out the old daguerreotype, studying Sarah's gentle smile and Emily's bright eyes until his vision blurred and he had to put it away. His neighbors had tried to help in those first months after the funeral. They'd brought food, offered assistance with ranch work, invited him to church socials and community gatherings, but Clay had withdrawn into himself, politely declining their kindness until they stopped offering it. The isolation had become a habit, then a prison, then a penance he felt he deserved. 5 years of solitude had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. His conversations had become shorter, his patience thinner, his tolerance for human foolishness nearly non-existent. The man who'd once been quick with a joke or a helping hand had transformed into someone harder, more brittle, like metal left. Too long in the cold. Yet beneath the accumulated layers of grief and isolation, something of the old Clay Barlow remained. The man who'd once believed in second chances, who'd chosen love over violence, who'd dreamed of watching his daughter grow into womanhood. That man stirred occasionally, usually when he least expected it, reminding him that even the most wounded hearts could still beat with hope. The morning routine continued. Boots, coffee, barn, horses, silence. But change had a way of arriving when a man least expected it, often wearing a face he'd never imagined and challenging assumptions he'd held as sacred truth. Clay didn't know it yet, but his ordered world was about to collide with forces that would test everything he thought he knew about family, faith, and the possibility of redemption. As he settled into his evening chair with the day's last cup of coffee, Clay allowed himself one glance at the daguerreotype before tucking it away. Sarah and Emily smiled back at him across the years, frozen in happier times, reminding him of what love looked like when it lived and breathed and filled a house with laughter. Tomorrow would bring another day of the same routine, the same silence, the same careful distance from a world that had already taken too much from him. But tomorrow would also bring something else. Something that would force Clay Barlow to choose between the safety of his isolation and the terrifying possibility that his heart might be capable of love again. The wagon train appeared on Tuesday morning like a dust cloud with purpose, rolling into Clearwater with the steady rhythm of wheels that had covered 1,000 miles. Clay watched from his porch as the procession wound through town. 3 freight wagons loaded with supplies, a passenger coach with travel-weary faces pressed against its windows, and a handful of riders bringing up the rear. He'd seen dozens of such trains pass through over the years, most of them heading west toward Oregon or California with dreams of gold and green valleys. This one looked different somehow, more businesslike than optimistic, carrying the weight of necessity rather than hope. Clay finished his morning coffee and rode into town for supplies, arriving just as the wagons were being unloaded in front of the general store. Townspeople had gathered to watch the proceedings, their conversations creating a low buzz of curiosity and speculation. Wagon trains meant news from the outside world, letters from distant relatives, and goods that made frontier life a little more bearable. "Afternoon, Mr. Barlow," called out Henry Watts, the store owner, as Clay tied his horse to the hitching post. "Quite a sight, isn't it? Biggest train we've seen in months." Clay nodded, studying the organized chaos of unloading. Crates and barrels moved from wagons to storefront with practiced efficiency, supervised by a stern-faced man in a dusty brown coat who consulted a thick ledger with every transfer. The passengers had emerged from their coach to stretch their legs and take in the town. A middle-aged couple, an elderly man with a walking stick, and a young black girl who stood apart from the others. The girl couldn't have been more than 13 or 14, dressed in simple traveling clothes that had seen better days. She carried herself with a straight-back dignity that seemed older than her years, her dark eyes taking in everything with sharp intelligence. A worn leather satchel hung from her shoulder, its surface cracked and faded, but held closed with careful stitches and determination. "That young lady's been riding alone since Denver," Henry said, following Clay's gaze. "Trainmaster says her folks died of cholera somewhere east of there. She's got family supposedly waiting in Oregon, but..." He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. Clay watched as the girl approached one of the freight drivers, asking questions about the horses in his team. Her voice carried across the square, clear, confident, unafraid. The driver laughed at something she said, then pointed toward the animal's legs, apparently explaining some aspect of their care. The girl nodded seriously, absorbing the information like a sponge. "She certainly has opinions about horses," Henry observed. "Been talking to every driver and rider since they arrived. Claims she knows more about them than most grown men. Does she now?" Clay's tone held skepticism, tinged with amusement. Inside the general store, Clay gathered his usual supplies, while keeping half an ear on the conversations swirling around him. The girl, Ella, someone had called her, had apparently made quite an impression during the journey from Denver. According to the trainmaster, she'd helped birth a foal when one of the mares went into labor, diagnosed lameness in a led horse, and prevented a potential stampede by noticing signs of unrest before anyone else. Remarkable young lady, Doc Henderson said, appearing at Clay's elbow. I've been talking with her about her family's situation. Tragic circumstances, but she's handling them with more grace than many adults would manage. Where's she headed? Clay asked, though he wasn't sure why it mattered to him. Oregon, supposedly. Has relatives there, though the details seem vague. Doc's expression grew concerned. I'm not entirely convinced these relatives exist, if I'm being honest. She carries herself like someone who's been taking care of herself for quite some time. Through the store window, Clay could see Ella examining the wagon train's horses with professional interest. She moved around each animal systematically, checking their legs, looking at their teeth, running her hands along their necks and flanks. The drivers watched her with growing respect as she pointed out potential problems and suggested remedies. That spotted mare's favoring her right front, Clay heard her say to one of the drivers. Not lame yet, but she's got something brewing. In that hoof, you might want to check for stones or maybe a loose shoe before you push on. The driver knelt down to examine the hoof and whistled low. I'll be damned. How'd you spot that? Horse hasn't been limping. She shifts her weight when she thinks nobody's looking, Ella explained matter-of-factly. Horses are honest about pain if you know how to read them. Clay found himself stepping outside to get a better look at this young horse expert. Up close, Ella appeared even smaller than she had from a distance, but there was nothing childish about the way she handled the animals. Her movements were confident and economical, her touch firm but gentle. The horses responded to her with the kind of trust that usually took years to develop. You know horses, Clay said, not really a question. Ella looked up at him, measuring him with dark eyes that held too much knowledge for someone her age. Yes, sir. My daddy taught me. He said horses don't lie, so if you want to understand them, you better learn to be honest too. Your daddy teach you anything else? How to ride, how to gentle colts, how to read sign in a hoof or a limp. She straightened, meeting his gaze directly. How to respect what you can't control and control what you can. Clay found himself oddly impressed despite his natural skepticism. Those are good lessons. Yes, sir, they are. Ella adjusted the strap of her satchel, the leather creaking softly. You the rancher folks been talking about? Mr. Barlow? I am. They say you've got horses. Some. They say you've got one nobody can ride. Clay felt the familiar stirring of irritation that came whenever people discussed his business. Diablo's not for riding. He's wild and he's staying that way. Why? The simple question caught him off guard. Because some things are meant to stay wild. Ella considered this seriously. My daddy used to say that everything wild wants to find its place in the world. Sometimes that place is staying wild, and sometimes it's finding the right partner. The trick is knowing which is which. Your daddy sounds like he was a wise man. He was. Something flickered across her face, grief, perhaps, or longing. He's gone now. I'm sorry for your loss. Ella nodded, accepting the condolence with dignity. Thank you, but he taught me everything he could before he left. Said knowledge doesn't die with the teacher if the student remembers the lessons. A small crowd had gathered to watch their conversation, drawn by the novelty of someone engaging Clay Barlow in extended dialogue. Sheriff Mills stood nearby, his expression alert, but not worried. Martha watched from her saloon porch, arms crossed, and head tilted with interest. Doc Henderson hovered close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough back to avoid intruding. So about this horse nobody can ride, Ella said, her tone casual but her eyes intense. What makes him so special? Clay found himself answering, despite his better judgment. He's a mustang. Caught him 2 years ago, but he won't take a saddle, won't take a bridle, won't let anyone on his back. Tried everything short of breaking his spirit, which I won't do. Maybe you tried the wrong things. The comment sparked something hot in Clay's chest, pride perhaps, or simple stubbornness. I've been working with horses longer than you've been alive, girl. Yes, sir, I'm sure you have. Ella's voice remained respectful but firm. But time doesn't always equal understanding. My daddy could gentle the wildest bronc you ever saw, and he learned it from watching the Lakota work with their ponies. Said, white men usually try to force what they should coax. The implications of her words hit the gathering crowd like a slap. Someone muttered under their breath about uppity children who needed to learn their place. Clay felt every eye on him, waiting to see how he'd respond to such bold talk from a young black girl who had no business challenging his expertise. The old Clay, the gunslinger, would have shut down such impertinence with a look that could freeze blood. But something about Ella's calm confidence made him pause. She wasn't being disrespectful. She was simply stating what she believed to be true. And despite his wounded pride, Clay found himself curious about her certainty. "You think you could ride him?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge that made several bystanders step back. "I think I'd like the chance to find out." The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol. Clay stared at this slip of a girl who'd just proposed to do what no man in the territory had managed. Around them, the crowd had gone silent, sensing they were witnessing something significant. "Tell you what," Clay said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you can ride Diablo, really ride him, not just hang on for a few seconds, I'll adopt you myself." The challenge tumbled from his lips before he could stop it, born from some mixture of irritation, curiosity, and the reckless impulse that had gotten him into trouble more times than he could count. As soon as the words were spoken, he wanted to take them back, but dozens of witnesses had heard his offer. Ella studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his intentions. Then she nodded once, firmly. "All right, Mr. Barlow, I accept." The crowd erupted in excited murmurs. Sheriff Mills looked worried. Doc Henderson shook his head slowly. Martha laughed out loud from her porch, the sound carrying equal parts amusement and disbelief. Clay stared at the girl who'd just turned his idle challenge into a binding agreement. She stood there calmly, one hand resting on her worn satchel, meeting his gaze with the steady confidence of someone who'd never learned to doubt herself. What had he just done? The broken bridle hung on a nail in Clay's barn, like a monument to failure. 3 separate attempts to harness Diablo had left the leather straps torn and useless, the metal bits twisted beyond repair. Each piece told a story of the mustang's refusal to surrender his wild nature, and Clay had kept the remnants as a reminder of the limits of human will. Now, 24 hours after his impulsive challenge, Clay found himself staring at those leather fragments while second-guessing every decision that had led to this moment. What had possessed him to make such an offer? A slip of a girl claiming she could accomplish what no grown man had managed seemed absurd in the cold light of morning. Diablo paced his corral with restless energy, as if sensing the attention focused on him. The mustang stood 16 hands high, his black coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the morning sun. White markings on his face and legs only emphasized the wild intelligence in his dark eyes. He'd been magnificent when Clay first spotted him running with a small band of mares in the high country, and 2 years of captivity hadn't diminished that magnificence one bit. Clay had tried everything he knew to gentle the horse. Patient approach, work, gradual desensitization, even bringing in a supposed expert from Billings who claimed he could break any animal in 3 days. Diablo had sent that man to Doc Henderson's office with a dislocated shoulder and a healthy respect for untamed spirit. The memory brought back another image. Emily, at 10 years old, sitting on the corral fence and watching Clay work with a difficult colt. She'd possessed an intuitive understanding of horses that had amazed even Sarah, who'd grown up around the animals. "He's scared, Papa," Emily had said, studying the colt's body language with serious concentration. "See how he keeps looking toward the gate? He wants to know he can leave if he needs to." Clay had paused in his work, really looking at the young horse for the first time. Emily was right. The colt's attention kept drifting toward escape routes, his muscles tense with flight readiness. "What would you do?" Clay had asked, genuinely curious about his daughter's perspective. Move slower. Let him choose to come closer instead of making him. Animals trust better when they feel like they have a choice. The advice had worked. Within an hour, the colt was accepting Clay's touch, then a halter, then eventually a saddle. Emily had beamed with pride at her father's success, never realizing she'd been the one to provide the key insight. Now, 5 years later, Clay wondered if that same insight might apply to Diablo. Had he been approaching the Mustang all wrong? Trying to impose his will instead of earning trust? The thought troubled him because it suggested Ella might actually know something he didn't. Word of the challenge had spread through Clearwater faster than wildfire. By evening, half the town was planning to witness the attempt. Clay had set the time for Saturday afternoon, giving Ella 3 days to prepare, and himself 3 days to figure out how to gracefully extract them both from this situation. But when he'd suggested perhaps they should reconsider the whole arrangement, Ella had looked at him with such quiet determination that he'd fallen silent. "I don't go back on my word, Mr. Barlow," she'd said simply. "Do you?" The question had stung because Clay prided himself on being a man whose word meant something. In his gunfighting days, his reputation had depended as much on keeping his promises as on his speed with a pistol. If he backed down now, especially in front of the whole town, what would that say about his character? Wednesday morning found Ella standing outside Diablo's corral, maintaining a respectful distance while studying the Mustang's behavior. She didn't speak to the horse or try to approach, just watched with the patient attention of someone gathering information. Clay observed her from the barn doorway, noting how still she kept herself, how her breathing remained calm and steady, even when Diablo snorted and pawed the ground. "He's beautiful," she said softly, not turning around but somehow knowing Clay was there. "He's dangerous. Beautiful things often are." Ella shifted slightly, angling herself so Diablo could see her clearly without feeling cornered. "My daddy used to say that wild horses remember every kindness and every cruelty. This one's been treated well, but he hasn't been understood." Clay found himself stepping closer, drawn despite his reservations. "What makes you say that?" Look at his eyes. No meanness there, just wariness. And see how he keeps testing the fence line? He's not trying to escape, he's checking his boundaries. A truly wild horse would have found a way out by now or would have given up completely. This one's still hoping for something better. The observation struck Clay as uncomfortably perceptive. He'd always assumed Diablo's restlessness came from a desire for freedom, but Ella seemed to be suggesting something more complex, a horse caught between worlds, neither fully wild nor willing to be tamed. "What do you see when you look at him?" Clay asked, surprising himself with the question. Ella considered her answer carefully. "I see a horse who's never learned to trust, because nobody's ever shown him what trust looks like. He's been caught, contained and challenged, but never invited into partnership. Partnership? That's how my daddy taught me to think about it. Horses don't want to be our slaves, they want to be our partners, but partnership means both sides have to agree to the arrangement." Clay thought about the broken bridle, about all his failed attempts to impose his will on Diablo. Had he been treating the Mustang like a problem to be solved, rather than a being with his own thoughts and feelings? Emily would have understood immediately. She'd always seen horses as individuals with personalities and preferences, not just tools to be used. Sarah, too, had possessed that gift of seeing each animal as unique. Clay realized with a pang that in his grief, he'd lost touch with that more subtle approach to horsemanship. Thursday brought rain, turning the corral into mud and giving everyone an excuse to postpone serious preparation. But Ella continued her vigil, now carrying an old slicker to keep dry while she maintained her patient observation of Diablo. The Mustang seemed to be growing accustomed to her presence, no longer snorting or tossing his head when she appeared. "She's got patience, I'll give her that," Doc Henderson said, joining Clay on his covered porch to watch Ella's solitary vigil. "Most folks would have given up standing in the rain by now." Most folks wouldn't have accepted the challenge in the first place. True enough. Doc was quiet for a moment, rain pattering on the roof above them. You know, Emily used to sit out there just like that when you brought home a new horse. Remember? She'd study them for hours before ever trying to make contact. The comparison hit Clay like a physical blow. He did remember. Emily perched on the fence or standing at a safe distance, her young face serious with concentration as she tried to understand each horse's unique character. This girl reminds you of her, Doc continued gently. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Clay didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. Watching Ella's patient dedication to understanding Diablo stirred memories he'd tried to bury along with his daughter. The way she moved around horses, the careful attention she paid to their body language, even her quiet confidence. It all echoed Emily in ways that both comforted and tortured him. Friday arrived with clear skies and mounting tension. Word had spread beyond Clearwater's borders, and people were riding in from neighboring ranches to witness the spectacle. Clay began to regret his impulsive challenge more with each passing hour. Win or lose, this event would change things in ways he couldn't predict, but it was too late to back down now. The whole territory would be watching tomorrow, waiting to see if a young black girl could accomplish what no one else had managed. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Clay found himself hoping she would succeed, not just for her sake, but for Diablo's, and perhaps for his own as well. The broken bridle seemed to mock him every time he passed it, a reminder of all his failures with the magnificent horse. But maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would prove that some problems required a different kind of solution. One that couldn't be forced or rushed, only patiently discovered through understanding and respect. Emily would have known what that solution looked like. Perhaps Ella did too. Saturday arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the Montana mountains look close enough to touch. By noon, more than 50 people had gathered around Clay's corral, creating the largest crowd. His ranch had seen since Sarah's funeral. Men leaned against the fence rails, women clustered under makeshift shade, and children perched on wagon sides for better views. Clay stood apart from the crowd, his stomach tight with apprehension. This whole affair had spiraled far beyond what he'd intended, turning into a public spectacle that would be talked about for years, regardless of the outcome. Sheriff Mills had positioned himself strategically near the corral gate, ready to intervene if things went badly. Doc Henderson waited nearby with his medical bag, his presence a sobering reminder of what could happen when wild horses and human ambition collided. Ella appeared calm as still water, moving through her preparations with methodical precision. She'd spent the morning brushing the dust from her simple dress and braiding her hair back tightly. Now she stood beside the corral, studying Diablo one final time before the attempt. "You sure about this, young lady?" Sheriff Mills asked quietly. "No shame in changing your mind. Diablo's put 3 men in the dirt, and they were all experienced riders." Ella looked up at him with those steady, dark eyes. "Thank you for the concern, Sheriff, but I'm sure." The Mustang sensed the crowd's energy and responded with increased restlessness. He paced his enclosure with high-stepping precision, neck arched and nostrils flared. The audience stirred uneasily as they watched 16 hands of unpredictable power testing the fence rails with obvious frustration. Clay found himself remembering Sarah's old recipe book, tucked away in the kitchen cupboard where he hadn't touched it in 3 years. She'd written notes in the margins of her favorite dishes, little reminders about Emily's preferences, adjustments for feeding ranch hands during harvest time. Memories of family gatherings preserved in faded ink. The book represented everything warm and nurturing that had once filled his house, all the small kindnesses that made a house into a home. Why was he thinking about that now? Perhaps because watching Ella prepare for this impossible task reminded him of Sarah's quiet confidence in the kitchen, the way she'd approached even the most complex recipes with patient determination. Both women seemed to understand that some achievements couldn't be rushed or forced, only coaxed into existence through skill and intuition. "I'm ready," Ella announced, her voice carrying clearly across the expectant crowd. Clay opened the gate with hands that trembled slightly. "You remember our agreement?" "Yes, sir. If I can ride him, you'll adopt me." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither had fully considered when they'd made their bargain. Clay nodded stiffly and stepped back as Ella entered the corral. Diablo immediately wheeled to face her, ears pinned back and eyes rolling white. The crowd fell silent, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. Whether triumph or tragedy remained to be seen. Ella made no move toward the horse. Instead, she walked calmly to the center of the corral and simply stood there, breathing slowly and keeping her gaze soft rather than direct. Diablo snorted and pranced, clearly agitated by her presence, but she showed no fear. Minutes passed. The crowd grew restless, murmuring among themselves about what the girl was waiting for. Clay found himself leaning forward, trying to understand Ella's strategy. This wasn't what he'd expected. No ropes, no gradual approach, no attempt to corner or contain the animal. Then something shifted. Diablo's ears came forward slightly, and his pacing slowed. Ella remained motionless, a point of calm in his world of nervous energy. The mustang's breathing began to match hers, deep, steady, unhurried. "Easy, beautiful boy," Ella said softly, her voice carrying no more than 10 feet. "Nobody's going to hurt you. Nobody's going to force you." Clay had never heard anyone talk to Diablo with such gentle respect. Most people address the horse as a problem to be overcome, a challenge to be conquered. Ella spoke to him as if he were a treasured friend whose feelings mattered. Diablo took a tentative step toward her, then stopped. Ella continued her soft murmuring. Not quite words, but something more like music. The mustang's head dropped slightly, and Clay realized with amazement that the horse was actually considering approaching this small human, who offered neither threat nor demand. Another step, then another. The crowd held its collective breath as Diablo moved within arm's reach of Ella, his massive frame towering over her slight figure. She still made no move to touch him, simply continued her gentle song and let him make his own choices. When Diablo finally lowered his head to sniff her shoulder, the watching crowd released a simultaneous sigh. Ella slowly raised one hand, letting the horse examine her scent and decide whether to accept her touch. When his nose bumped against her palm, she smiled, not triumphantly, but with quiet joy. What followed seemed impossible to those watching. Ella gradually introduced touch, starting with gentle strokes along Diablo's neck and working slowly toward his shoulders and back. The horse quivered with nervous energy, but didn't pull away. His eyes, which had always held wild defiance, now showed something approaching trust. "How is she doing that?" someone whispered. Clay wondered the same thing. In all his attempts to work with Diablo, he'd never seen the horse so calm with a human presence. The mustang actually seemed to be enjoying Ella's attention, leaning slightly into her touch and nickering softly. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Ella positioned herself beside Diablo's shoulder and in one fluid motion vaulted onto his back. The crowd gasped, expecting an explosion of bucking and rearing. Instead, Diablo stood perfectly still. Ella sat tall and straight, her hands resting lightly on the horse's neck rather than gripping his mane. Horse and rider seemed to communicate through some invisible language, and when Diablo finally moved, it was with the controlled grace of a dance partner rather than the violence of a bronc trying to dislodge an unwanted burden. They moved around the corral in perfect harmony, walking, then trotting, then flowing into a smooth canter that drew appreciative murmurs from the watching crowd. Ella guided Diablo with subtle shifts of weight and gentle pressure from her legs, never pulling or demanding, but somehow conveying her wishes in ways the horse understood and chose to honor. Clay stood transfixed, watching something he'd believed impossible. This wasn't the domination he'd tried to achieve with Diablo, This was partnership, exactly as Ella had described it. The mustang hadn't surrendered his spirit. He'd found someone worthy of sharing it with. After several circuits of the corral, Ella brought Diablo to a stop in front of Clay. The horse stood calmly, breathing easily, showing no signs of distress or resentment. If anything, he seemed proud of what they'd accomplished together. "Well, Mr. Barlow," Ella said with quiet dignity, "I believe I've kept my part of our bargain." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Clay barely heard them. He was staring at this remarkable girl who'd just proven that patience and understanding could accomplish what force never could. She'd ridden Diablo not by breaking his spirit, but by honoring it, and in doing so, she'd shown Clay a truth he'd forgotten somewhere along the way. "Yes," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the celebration. "Yes, you have." As Ella slipped down from Diablo's back and the horse nuzzled her shoulder affectionately, Clay realized his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. He'd made a promise, and now he had to keep it. This slip of a girl was about to become his responsibility, his family, his daughter. The thought terrified and thrilled him in equal measure, reminding him of Sarah's recipe book and all the small kindnesses that made a house into a home. Perhaps it was time to dust off those recipes and learn to cook for two again. The first week of living together passed in a series of careful negotiations, each small interaction mapping the boundaries of their strange new arrangement. Clay had cleared out his study, moving boxes of Sarah's books and papers to make room for Ella's few possessions. The worn leather satchel that had traveled with her from Denver found a place on the windowsill, its contents never fully revealed, but obviously precious. They circled each other like cautious cats, each trying to determine the other's habits and expectations. Clay rose before dawn as always, but now he found himself moving more quietly through the house, conscious of the sleeping girl in the room across the hall. Ella adapted to his schedule without complaint, appearing in the kitchen each morning, dressed and ready for whatever the day might bring. "Coffee?" Clay had asked that first Monday morning, holding up the pot uncertainly. "Yes, please," Ella replied, accepting the cup with formal politeness, "though I usually take it with milk if you have it." Clay did have milk, though he rarely used it himself. The simple request forced him to consider details of domestic life he'd ignored for years. How did one feed a growing girl? What did she need that he hadn't thought to provide? The questions multiplied faster than he could answer them. Ella proved remarkably capable around the ranch, possessing skills that went far beyond her expertise with horses. She gathered eggs without disturbing the hens, milked their solitary cow with practiced efficiency, and split kindling with the precise technique of someone who'd learned to contribute to household chores early in life. "Where did you learn all this?" Clay asked, watching her mend a section of fence with professional competence. "My daddy taught me that useful people don't get left behind," she replied simply, testing the tension of her repair work. "Said I should learn everything I could, so I'd never be a burden to anybody." The comment stung because it suggested a childhood marked by uncertainty and the constant need to prove her worth. Clay found himself wondering about her life before the wagon train, about the father who'd taught her so much and the circumstances that had left her traveling alone across dangerous territory. In the evenings, they sat on opposite ends of the porch, maintaining a polite distance while watching the sun paint the mountains purple and gold. Their conversations remained carefully neutral, discussions of weather, ranch work, and the progress of various animals. Neither ventured into more personal territory, though Clay sometimes caught Ella watching him with curious eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. The most awkward moments came when Clay glimpsed something that reminded him sharply of Emily. Ella's laugh, when it came, carried the same musical quality that had filled his house years ago. Her careful attention to the horses echoed his daughter's intuitive understanding of the animals. Even the way she sat at the kitchen table, feet swinging slightly because the chairs were too high, brought back memories that both warmed and wounded his heart. One evening, while searching for a missing bridle strap, Clay found himself in Emily's room for the first time in months. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating the carefully preserved space with silver light. Emily's hairbrush still lay on the dresser where she'd left it that final morning, delicate silver with her initials engraved on the back, a gift from Sarah for her 10th birthday. Clay picked up the brush, running his thumb over the smooth metal surface. Emily had been so proud of it, brushing her hair every night before bed and showing it off to anyone who'd admire its elegance. Sarah had found her daughter brushing her doll's hair with it one afternoon, explaining seriously that ladies needed to take proper care of their appearance. The memory was so vivid that Clay could almost hear Emily's voice echoing down the hallway. For a moment, the past felt more real than the present, and he had to grip the dresser to steady himself against the wave of loss that threatened to drown him. "Mr. Barlow?" Ella's voice came softly from the doorway. "Are you all right?" Clay quickly set down the brush, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable moment. "Fine, just looking for something." Ella stepped into the room with the careful reverence of someone entering a shrine. Her gaze took in the preserved details, the neatly made bed, the books arranged just so, the doll sitting propped against the pillows. "This was your daughter's room," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Yes, she must have been very special. Clay's throat tightened. She was. Ella moved closer to the dresser, studying the brush without touching it. "My mama had one just like this. Different initials, but the same pattern around the edges. She used to brush my hair every night before bed, counting out 100 strokes and telling me stories about when she was little." "What happened to her?" Clay asked, then immediately regretted the question. Some wounds were too private to share with virtual strangers, but Ella answered without apparent distress. "Cholera took both my parents somewhere outside Denver. I was with them at the end, but I didn't get sick. Sometimes I wonder why I was spared when they weren't." "I wonder the same thing about my family," Clay admitted. "Why I was away when they needed me, why I came back to nothing but graves and silence." They stood together in Emily's room, two people bound by loss and circumstance, each carrying grief that felt too heavy to bear alone. The silver hairbrush caught moonlight between them, a symbol of all the small rituals that made family life precious and their absence so devastating. "Would you tell me about her?" Ella asked eventually. "Your daughter?" Clay found himself speaking before he could reconsider. "Emily was fearless. 11 years old and afraid of nothing, not thunder, not snakes, not strange horses 3 times her size. Sarah used to worry she'd get herself hurt being so bold, but Emily had good instincts. She knew which risks were worth taking and which ones weren't. She sounds like she would have been fun to know." "She would have liked you," Clay said, surprising himself with the admission. "She would have admired how you handled Diablo. Emily always respected anyone who could communicate. With animals, I would have liked to know her too." They left the room together, Clay pulling the door closed with careful reverence, but something had shifted between them in those few minutes among Emily's possessions. The rigid politeness that had characterized their first week began to soften into something approaching genuine companionship. The next morning, Clay found Ella in the barn, brushing Diablo's coat to a glossy shine. The mustang stood quietly under her attention, occasionally turning his head to nuzzle her shoulder affectionately. The sight struck Clay as remarkable. In 2 weeks, this girl had accomplished what he'd failed to achieve in 2 years. "He trusts you," Clay observed. "Trust has to be earned," Ella replied, working carefully around a sensitive spot on the horse's flank. "But once you have it, it's the most valuable thing in the world." Clay understood she wasn't just talking about horses. Trust between them would take time to develop, built through countless small interactions and shared experiences. But watching her gentle competence with Diablo, Clay began to believe it might be possible. The silver hairbrush remained on Emily's dresser, but its sting had lessened somehow. Perhaps some objects were meant to bridge the gap between past and future, helping wounded hearts remember that love didn't die with the beloved. It simply waited for new opportunities to flourish. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Clay found himself teaching Ella to handle a rifle. The lesson had begun practically enough. She'd spotted wolf tracks near the chicken coop and asked what they should do about predators. But as he watched her shoulder the Winchester with natural competence, Clay realized the instruction had become something more personal. "Keep both eyes open," he said, standing behind her to adjust her stance. "Most folks think they need to close one eye to aim, but you see better with both." Ella nodded, settling the rifle more comfortably against her shoulder. "My daddy taught me to shoot, but he only had an old musket. This is much nicer." "Your daddy was a military man? Buffalo soldier?" Ella said with unmistakable pride. 10th Cavalry. "He used to say that being a good soldier meant protecting what mattered, whether that was your country, your family, or your own dignity." Clay felt a stir of respect for the man who'd raised this remarkable girl. The Buffalo soldiers had earned recognition as some of the finest cavalry troops in the army, despite facing prejudice from the very people they'd sworn to protect. It explained much about Ella's bearing. The straight spine, the direct gaze, the quiet confidence that came from being raised by someone who'd served with honor. "He sounds like a good man. The best." Ella squeezed the trigger smoothly, sending her shot within an inch of the target Clay had set up 50 yards away. He said honor wasn't something you inherited. It was something you earned fresh every day through your choices. The comment reminded Clay of his own military service, back before the gunfighting years had complicated his relationship with honor. He'd served in the war as a young man, fighting with distinction until a piece of Confederate shrapnel had ended his formal military career. Somewhere in his bedroom dresser, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, lay the medal they'd given him for valor during a particularly brutal engagement outside Atlanta. He hadn't looked at that medal in years, hadn't wanted to be reminded of the man he'd been before grief and violence had carved away pieces of his soul. But Ella's mention of her father's service stirred memories of when Clay had believed in something larger than his own pain. "We should head back," Clay said, noting the position of the sun. "I want to check the fence line before dark." They rode back toward the ranch together, Ella mounted on gentle Copper, while Clay took Old Blue. She'd proven herself competent in the saddle, though her style differed markedly from the rough-and-ready approach favored by most ranch hands. Her seat was secure but relaxed, her hands light on the reins, and she communicated with her mount through subtle shifts of weight rather than aggressive kicks and pulls. "Mr. Barlow," she said as they crested the hill overlooking his property, "who are those men by your house?" Clay followed her gaze and felt his stomach tighten. 3 riders waited in his yard, their horses stamping impatiently while the men conferred among themselves. Even at a distance, Clay could see they weren't local, their clothes too fine, their posture too formal for working ranchers. "Trouble, most likely," he said grimly. "Stay close and let me do the talking." As they drew nearer, Clay recognized the type, if not the individuals. City men playing at frontier business, probably representatives of the land development company Sheriff Mills had mentioned. Their leader was a thin man with carefully waxed mustache and eyes that missed nothing. His companions looked like hired muscle dressed up in store-bought clothes. "Mr. Barlow," the thin man called out as they approached. "I'm Samuel Hutchins, representing Rocky Mountain Development Corporation. We'd like to discuss a business proposition with you." Clay dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible but ready. Years of reading dangerous situations had taught him to trust his instincts, and everything about these men set his nerves on edge. "My land's not for sale," Clay said simply. "Now don't be hasty," Hutchins replied with an oily smile. "You haven't heard our offer yet. We're prepared to pay quite generously for your property, more than market value considering the remote location." "I said it's not for sale." Hutchins' smile faltered slightly. Perhaps you should consider your position more carefully. A man alone on an isolated ranch faces many risks. Accidents happen, fires start. Sometimes the local law enforcement is too far away to help when trouble comes calling. The threat was delivered with casual politeness, but its meaning was unmistakable. Clay felt familiar anger building in his chest, the cold fury that had once made him dangerous to cross. His hand drifted unconsciously toward where his gun belt would have hung. "Mr. Hutchins," Ella said clearly, her young voice cutting through the tension. "That sounded very much like a threat to me. Would you like to repeat it for clarification?" Clay shot her a sharp look, but Ella sat straight in her saddle, meeting Hutchins' gaze with steady composure. Her interruption had caught all three men off guard. They'd apparently dismissed her as irrelevant to their business. "I'm sorry, miss," Hutchins said with patronizing courtesy. "This is a conversation between men. Perhaps you should run along and play while the adults discuss important matters. Perhaps you should remember that threatening law-abiding citizens is a federal crime," Ella replied calmly. "My father taught me that soldiers swear an oath to protect people from exactly this kind of intimidation." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty that right and wrong were clear-cut concepts, reminded Clay powerfully of his younger self. Before the world had worn away his sharp edges, he'd possessed that same unwavering moral clarity. The memory of his medal, gathering dust in its tissue paper wrapping, suddenly felt like a rebuke. "You're out of line, girl," one of Hutchins' companions growled. Clay stepped forward, his body language shifting in ways that made all three visitors suddenly alert. The gunfighter's stance came back naturally, balanced, loose, ready for violence. "If necessary, the girl's right," Clay said quietly. "You made a threat. Now you can apologize and leave, or we can discuss your business with Sheriff Mills. Your choice." Hutchins studied Clay with new attention, apparently recognizing something in his bearing that suggested backing down might be wise. "We meant no offense, Mr. Barlow, simply trying to impress upon you the wisdom of accepting our generous offer. Consider me unimpressed. Get off my land." The three men mounted their horses with dignified haste, but Hutchins couldn't resist a parting shot. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Barlow. Sometimes people change their minds when they have time to think things through properly." Clay watched them ride away, his anger still simmering just below the surface. He'd dealt with their type before, men who believed money and intimidation could overcome any obstacle. They'd be back, probably with more serious threats and better prepared for resistance. "You shouldn't have spoken up," he told Ella as they unsaddled their horses. "Men like that don't forget when they feel disrespected." "I couldn't just sit there and listen to them threaten you," Ella replied. "Besides, somebody needed to remind them that their behavior was wrong. Wrong doesn't stop bullets. Neither does staying silent when evil people think they can do whatever they want." Clay paused in brushing Old Blue, struck by the simple truth in her words. When had he stopped believing that doing right mattered more than staying safe? When had he decided that avoiding conflict was more important than standing up for principles? That evening, alone in his room, Clay opened his dresser drawer and unwrapped the medal he'd hidden away. The bronze star felt heavier than he remembered, its ribbon faded but still bearing the colors of courage and sacrifice. He'd earned it for charging a Confederate position to rescue wounded comrades, risking his own life because abandoning them would have been unthinkable. That young soldier would have understood Ella's instinctive response to Hutchins' threats. Honor demanded action, even when action carried risks. Perhaps it was time to remember what that felt like, to stand for something larger than his own survival. Clay pinned the medal to his shirt and looked at himself in the mirror. The reflection showed a man who'd forgotten how to be proud of his service, his principles, his willingness to protect what mattered. But with Ella's example to guide him, maybe he could remember how to be that man again. The trip to the county seat required a full day's travel, bumping along dusty roads in Clay's wagon, while Ella sat beside him, unusually quiet. She'd been subdued since his announcement that they needed to make their arrangement legal. to file the proper adoption papers that would give her his name and protection under the law. "You nervous?" Clay asked, as they approached the sprawling buildings of Helena. "A little," Ella admitted. "Legal things make me nervous. Too many ways for something to go wrong." Clay understood her hesitation. His own experience with legal proceedings had been limited and generally unpleasant. But Sheriff Mills had been emphatic. With men like Hutchins sniffing around, Clay needed official documentation of his relationship with Ella. Informal arrangements wouldn't protect her if serious trouble came calling. The territorial courthouse occupied an imposing brick building in Helena's center, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun like judgmental eyes. Inside, the clerk's office buzzed with the peculiar energy of bureaucracy in motion, papers shuffling, stamps thudding, men in spectacles examining documents with practiced skepticism. "Adoption papers," Clay told the clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the perpetually harried expression of someone who'd seen every possible complication human nature could devise. "Names of the prospective parents and child? Clay Barlow and Ella." Clay paused, realizing he'd never learned her last name. In all their weeks together, the subject had simply never come up. "Washington," Ella supplied quietly. "Ella Washington." The clerk scribbled notes on an official form. "Age of the child?" 14, Ella answered. "Parents deceased?" "Yes, sir." "Documentation of death?" Ella shifted uncomfortably. "I don't have any papers. They died of cholera on the trail. We buried them ourselves." The clerk looked up sharply. "No death certificates? No witnesses to verify the deaths? No documentation of any kind?" "The wagon train master might remember," Ella offered. "But he continued on to Oregon after we reached Denver." Clay felt the first stirring of unease. Legal proceedings always seemed to require more documentation than real life provided, but the clerk's expression suggested more than routine complications. "Miss Washington," the clerk said carefully, "what was your father's full name?" "Sergeant. Major James Washington, 10th Cavalry, United States Army." The clerk's pen stopped moving. He set it down and studied Ella with new attention. "James Washington of the 10th Cavalry?" "Yes, sir." "Do you know something about my father?" The clerk excused himself and disappeared into a back room, leaving Clay and Ella sitting in uncomfortable silence. Through the windows, Helena's afternoon bustle continued normally, but inside the courthouse office, tension gathered like storm clouds. When the clerk returned, he carried a thick folder and wore the expression of someone who'd discovered something significant. "Miss Washington, I need to ask you some very specific questions. When and where was your father discharged from military service?" "He wasn't discharged," Ella replied. "He was on leave, taking my mother and me to Oregon, where she had family. We were supposed to return to his posting at Fort Robinson after we got settled." The clerk opened his folder and consulted several official-looking documents. "Miss Washington, according to military records, Sergeant Major James Washington was killed in action during an engagement with cattle rustlers near the Nebraska-Colorado border 6 months ago. He died in the line of duty while investigating reports of systematic theft from local ranchers." Ella's face went white. "That's impossible. My father died of cholera 3 weeks ago outside Denver. I was with him. I watched him die." According to these records, James Washington was pursuing evidence that certain cattle theft operations were being protected by corrupt territorial officials, men with connections to large development companies seeking to acquire ranch land through intimidation and violence. Clay felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. "What kind of development companies?" The clerk consulted another document. The investigation focused primarily on Rocky Mountain Development Corporation and their associates. It appears Sergeant Major Washington had gathered evidence of their illegal activities before his death. "Before his murder, you mean?" Clay said grimly. Ella stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't understand. My father was James Washington, but he wasn't a soldier anymore. He said he'd left that life behind to take care of my mother and me. Miss, the clerk said gently, is it possible your father was using an assumed name to protect you? If he was investigating dangerous people, he might have chosen to conceal his military identity. The suggestion hit Ella like a physical blow. Clay watched her struggle to reconcile the father she'd known with this revelation of hidden identity and secret missions. Everything she'd told him about her family took on new meaning in light of this information. The man who raised me taught me about horses and honor and standing up for what's right, Ella said slowly. He could handle a rifle and knew things about tracking and reading sign that seemed unusual for a farmer. But he never mentioned being a soldier. Military men often try to leave their service behind when they start families, the clerk observed. But it sounds like your father couldn't escape his duty entirely. Clay's mind raced through implications. If Ella's father had been investigating Rocky Mountain Development Corporation, then her presence at Clay's ranch wasn't coincidence. It was a continuation of the conflict that had killed her parents. Hutchins and his men weren't just trying to acquire land, they were eliminating threats to their operation. What evidence did James Washington gather? Clay asked. The clerk hesitated. I'm not authorized to share details of an ongoing military investigation, but I can tell you that his death was considered suspicious by his commanding officers. The official cause was listed as death in the line of duty, but questions remained about the circumstances. So he was murdered, Ella said flatly. That's the assumption, yes, along with his wife, who was traveling with him at the time. Ella sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the revelation that her parents' deaths weren't random tragedy, but calculated murder. Clay reached over and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. What about the adoption papers? Clay asked. That's going to be complicated, the clerk admitted. If Miss Washington's father was killed while on active military duty, there are specific protocols for handling the custody of military orphans. The Army may have claims on her guardianship. She's my responsibility now, Clay said firmly. We had an agreement. Your agreement may not carry legal weight if military authorities decide to intervene, particularly given the circumstances of her father's death and the ongoing investigation. Clay felt anger building in his chest, not at the clerk, who was simply doing his job, but at the system that seemed determined to complicate every attempt at building something good from tragedy. What do we need to do? File a formal petition for adoption, providing all available documentation of Miss Washington's identity and circumstances. The territorial court will review the case and make a determination based on her best interests. How long will that take? Several weeks, possibly months, and there's no guarantee of success, particularly if military authorities object to the arrangement. Clay and Ella left the courthouse with a stack of forms to complete and a growing sense that their simple arrangement had become entangled in forces beyond their control. The ride home passed in contemplative silence, both of them processing the day's revelations. I'm sorry, Ella said finally, as they neared Clay's ranch. I didn't know about any of this. If I'd realized my father's work might put you in danger. You've got nothing to apologize for, Clay interrupted. Your father was doing his duty, and you're just trying to survive. The fault lies with men like Hutchins, who think they can buy or kill their way to whatever they want. But now you're caught up in it too. Clay considered this as they pulled into his yard. The adoption papers in his pocket represented more than legal formalities. They were a declaration that he was willing to stand between Ella and whatever forces had killed her parents. The prospect should have terrified him, but instead he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond his own survival. Maybe it's time I was caught up in something that mattered, he said. Your father stood up to these people and died for it. The least I can do is make sure his daughter has a chance at the life he wanted for her. As they unloaded the wagon, Clay found himself thinking about honor, duty, and the obligations that came with caring about someone other than himself. The adoption papers might be complicated, but his commitment to Ella was becoming clearer with each passing day. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The barn fire started just after midnight on a Tuesday, orange flames leaping against the star-filled sky like demons dancing in celebration. Clay woke to the smell of smoke and Ella's urgent shaking, both of them stumbling outside in their nightclothes to watch 2 years of stored hay turn to ash and ember. "The horses!" Ella gasped, already running toward the corral where Diablo, Copper, and Old Blue milled nervously, spooked by the flames and smoke. They worked together to move the animals to the far pasture, Clay cursing himself for not seeing this escalation coming. Hutchins had made good on his subtle threats, choosing arson as his opening gambit in what promised to be an increasingly dangerous campaign. By dawn, nothing remained of the barn except smoldering timbers and the acrid smell of destruction. Doc Henderson arrived with the sunrise, having seen the glow from town, followed shortly by Sheriff Mills and a handful of concerned neighbors. They stood in a loose circle around the ruins, their faces grim with the understanding that this was just the beginning. "Anyone see who did this?" Mills asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Happened too fast and too quiet," Clay replied. "Professional work. They knew exactly where to set the fires for maximum damage with minimum risk." "Rocky Mountain Development?" Doc Henderson asked quietly. Clay nodded. "Has to be. This is what Hutchins meant by accidents happening to isolated ranchers." Sheriff Mills removed his hat and ran fingers through his graying hair. "Clay, I got to be honest with you. I can't prove they did this. And even if I could, the territorial authorities might not back my play against a company with their connections." "Then what do you suggest? Leave, take the girl and go somewhere these people can't find you. Start over." The suggestion hit Clay like a slap. After weeks of growing attachment to this land, this life, this strange new family arrangement with Ella, the idea of abandoning everything felt like another kind of death. "This is my home," Clay said firmly. "Sarah and Emily are buried here. I'm not running." "Then you need to understand what you're up against," Mills replied. "Rocky Mountain Development doesn't just buy land, they eliminate obstacles, and you've become a very large obstacle." Ella had remained silent during this exchange, but now she stepped forward with quiet determination. "My father didn't run from these people, and look what they did to him. Maybe running just delays the inevitable. Your father was trained to fight," Doc Henderson pointed out gently. "This isn't your battle, child. It became my battle when they murdered my parents," Ella replied with steel in her young voice. "And it became Mr. Barlow's battle when he chose to stand by me." Clay felt a surge of pride at her courage, mixed with fear for her safety. But she was right. Running would only postpone the confrontation while giving their enemies time to consolidate. "Their position and plan, more devastating attacks, Sheriff." Mills studied Clay's face and apparently saw something there that convinced him further argument would be futile. "All right then. If you're determined to make a stand, you'll need all the legal authority we can muster." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a deputy's badge, its tin surface reflecting the morning light. "I'm deputizing you, Clay, temporarily but with full territorial authority. That gives us legal justification for whatever actions we might need to take." Clay accepted the badge with mixed emotions. The weight of it felt familiar. He'd worn similar symbols of authority during his military service, back when he'd believed unequivocally in the rightness of his cause. Pinning it to his shirt felt like stepping back into a role he'd abandoned when grief and disillusionment had driven him to seek solitude. "What about backup?" Clay asked. "If they're willing to commit arson, they won't hesitate to escalate to murder." "I've sent word to Fort Robinson," Mills replied. "Given what we learned about James Washington's investigation, the military has a vested interest in seeing this through. They're sending a detachment, but it'll take them a week to get here. A week might be too long. Hutchins won't give us time to organize a proper defense." Doc Henderson cleared his throat. "Actually, you might have more support than you realize. Word's gotten around town about what these development people are trying to do. Folks are starting to understand that if they can drive you off your land, nobody's safe. Meaning? Meaning there are men in Clearwater who remember when you stood between them and trouble back in the old days. Some of them are willing to return the favor. The offer of community support surprised Clay. He'd assumed his years of isolation had severed whatever bonds of mutual respect he'd built during his more active years. But apparently, some debts of honor had longer memories than he'd realized. Over the next 2 days, a steady stream of visitors arrived at Clay's ranch. Martha brought food and ammunition, claiming her saloon customers had taken up a collection for the girls' protection. Henry Watts appeared with medical supplies and news. From town, even old Pete Morrison, who'd once faced down claim jumpers with Clay's help, rode out to offer his rifle and his experience. Like the old days, Pete said, checking the action on his Winchester, when men stood together against folks who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. But it wasn't quite like the old days, and Clay knew it. He was older now, carrying physical and emotional scars that had accumulated over years of hard living. The reflexes that had once made him dangerous were still there, but they felt rustier, requiring conscious effort to access. Most importantly, he now had something precious to protect, not just his own life or property, but Ella's future and safety. The girl herself had become central to their defensive planning, despite Clay's initial reluctance to involve her in anything dangerous. But Ella's skills with horses and her knowledge of tracking made her valuable for reconnaissance, and her steady nerves under pressure had impressed even the most skeptical volunteers. "She's got sand, that one," Pete observed, watching Ella organize their ammunition supplies with military precision. "Reminds me of her father, from what folks say." "About James Washington." "She reminds me of someone else, too," Clay replied, thinking of Emily's fearless spirit and Sarah's quiet competence under pressure. Wednesday brought ominous news from town. Hutchins had registered at the hotel with 6 companions, all of them armed and carrying themselves like professional gunmen. They'd made no secret of their presence, taking meals at Martha's saloon and making inquiries about Clay's ranch that sounded more like intelligence gathering than casual conversation. "They're planning something big," Sheriff Mills reported during his evening visit. "My sources say they've brought enough firepower for a small war." "How long do we have?" "Not long. They've been asking about your daily routines, the layout of your property, how many people might be willing to help you. They're gathering information for a coordinated assault." Clay studied the map he'd drawn of his property, marking defensive positions and escape routes with the methodical planning he'd learned during his military service. The ranch house sat on elevated ground with good sight lines in all directions, but it was also isolated and vulnerable to attack from multiple angles. "We need to force them to come to us on our terms," Clay decided. "Set up positions that give us advantages of cover and elevation, then let them know we're ready for whatever they're planning." "That's assuming they come at us directly," Mills pointed out. "These aren't frontier outlaws who'll charge in with guns blazing. They're professionals who look for the most efficient way to eliminate the problem." "Meaning?" "Meaning they might target Ella directly, knowing that would break your will to resist." The suggestion sent ice through Clay's veins. The idea of Ella facing the same fate as her parents, murdered by men who saw human life as just another obstacle to profit, triggered protective instincts he'd thought buried with his family. "That won't happen," Clay said quietly, his voice carrying the cold certainty that had once made men step aside when they saw him coming. Thursday evening brought an unexpected visitor, Ella's wagon train master, returning from Oregon with news that would change everything. He'd heard about the troubles in Clearwater and felt obligated to share information that might save lives. "That girl's father didn't die of cholera," he told Clay and Sheriff Mills. "He was shot in the back while watering the horses. Made it look like an accident, but I saw the powder burns. Someone got real close before they pulled the trigger. Why didn't you report it?" "To who? We were in the middle of nowhere, and the men who did it had papers claiming to be territorial marshals, said James Washington was wanted for desertion, and they were bringing him to justice." What did these fake marshals look like? The wagon master's description matched Hutchins' companions perfectly. Professional killers masquerading as law enforcement, using official-looking documents to murder a man who'd gotten too close to their operation. Friday morning found Clay standing on his porch, wearing his deputy's badge and watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold and crimson. Somewhere out there, men were planning to kill him and Ella, just as they'd killed her parents. But this time, the target wasn't an isolated traveler on a lonely trail. It was a man with friends, legal authority, and military training, defending ground he'd chosen and prepared. The badge felt heavy on his chest, weighted with responsibility and the memory of oaths he'd taken years ago. But it also felt right, like stepping back into a role he'd been born to fill. Whatever came next, Clay Barlow would meet it standing up, with his gun in his hand and his conscience clear. The final confrontation was coming, and for the first time in years, Clay found himself looking forward to a fight. Saturday dawned clear and cold, the kind of morning that made every sound carry for miles across the Montana landscape. Clay had risen before the stars faded, moving through his preparations with the methodical calm that had once served him well in dangerous situations. The handcrafted saddle he'd commissioned for Ella sat prominently on the porch railing, a symbol of permanence, of his faith that she would survive whatever this day brought. He'd worked on that saddle during the long evenings after she'd successfully ridden Diablo, carving intricate patterns into the leather and adjusting every strap for her small frame. It represented everything he hoped their future might hold: partnership, respect, and the kind of trust that could only be earned through time and shared challenges. "They're coming," Ella announced from her position at the upstairs window, her voice steady despite the circumstances. 7 riders approaching from the south." Clay checked his Colt .45 one final time, the familiar weight of it settling into his palm like an old friend returning home. Round the ranch house, his volunteers had taken their assigned positions. Pete Morrison behind the well, Doc Henderson in the root cellar with a clear field of fire, Sheriff Mills positioned to cover the main approach road. "Remember the plan." Clay called out to his defenders. "Let them commit to their attack before we reveal our positions, and nobody shoots until I give the signal." Hutchins led the group, his thin frame unmistakable even at a distance, but the men flanking him were clearly professionals. Their bearing, their spacing, the way they studied the terrain as they approached all spoke of military or law enforcement. Draining turned to darker purposes. They stopped just outside rifle range, close enough for conversation, but far enough back to retreat quickly if necessary. Hutchins dismounted and walked forward alone, his hands visible but resting near his weapon. "Mr. Barlow," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "We've come to discuss your final opportunity to sell your property. Recent events suggest you might be more receptive to reasonable negotiation." "The barn fire, you mean?" Clay stepped onto his porch, the deputy badge glinting on his chest. "That wasn't negotiation, that was arson. And I'm afraid you're talking to a sworn law officer now." Hutchins' expression tightened. "That badge doesn't change your situation, Barlow. You're still outnumbered and outgunned. Still just one man, trying to protect property that doesn't really belong to you anyway. What's that supposed to mean?" "It means we've done more research into your legal situation. That girl you're harboring, she's got no right to be here. And you've got no right to keep her. Her father stole property that belongs to Rocky Mountain Development, specifically evidence of livestock transactions that could damage our business relationships." Clay felt pieces clicking into place. "You mean evidence of cattle rustling?" "I mean evidence of perfectly legal business practices that certain military personnel chose to misinterpret. James Washington died because he wouldn't return stolen property that didn't belong to him. And his wife? Unfortunate witnesses have a way of complicating situations. The casual admission of murder sent rage coursing through Clay's veins, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper now would get them all killed. "So what do you want?" The girl and whatever papers her father left behind, give us those, and you can keep your ranch and your life. Refuse, and we'll take them anyway, along with everything else you think you own." "Ella doesn't have any papers," Clay said truthfully, "and she's under my protection now." "Your protection?" Hutchins laughed harshly. "You're a washed-up gunfighter playing at being respectable. You think that badge makes you dangerous? You think these farmers hiding around your property can stand against professional killers?" From the upstairs window, Ella's voice rang out clear and strong. "My father said that evil men always underestimate good ones because they can't understand. What motivates people to fight for something other than money?" Hutchins looked up at the window with obvious irritation. "Bring her down here, Barlow. Let's settle this like civilized people. She stays where she is. Then we'll come get her." Clay's hand moved to his gun. "You can try." The moment stretched. And taut between them, 7 armed men facing a fortified position, defended by people who'd chosen to stand together against intimidation and murder. Then Hutchins smiled coldly and stepped back toward his horse. "You've made your choice, Barlow. Now live with the consequences." He mounted quickly and spurred his horse back toward his companions. Clay watched them confer briefly, then spread out in a pattern that suggested coordinated assault tactics. These weren't random gunmen. They were soldiers turned mercenary, using military precision to solve civilian problems. "Here they come," Pete Morrison called out from behind the well. The attack began with suppressing fire aimed at the house's windows, forcing Ella to duck back from her observation post. Clay had expected this. The professionals would try to pin down their defenders while flanking movements got into position for the killing shots. But Clay had advantages too. He knew every rock, tree, and building on his property. His volunteers might not be professional fighters, but they were steady men with good rifles and strong motivation. Most importantly, they were fighting for something they believed in rather than just following orders for pay. The saddle on the porch railing caught a stray bullet, leather flying as the round tore through the carefully crafted handiwork. Clay felt the destruction like a physical blow, not just for the wasted labor, but for what it represented. These men would destroy everything good and beautiful if it served their purposes, leaving only emptiness and profit margins in their wake. That's when Clay's famous calm finally cracked, and the old gunfighter's instincts took control. Clay's first shot took down the flanker trying to circle around the barn ruins, the crack of his Colt echoing across the ranch yard like thunder. The man spun and fell, clutching his shoulder, and suddenly the coordinated assault became a desperate firefight as both sides sought cover and advantage. "Ella, stay down!" Clay shouted, moving from window to window as muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions around his property. But Ella had other ideas. Through the chaos of gunfire, Clay heard Diablo's distinctive whinny and turned to see the girl sliding down the back porch roof toward the corral. She'd managed to get to the Mustang somehow, and now horse and rider were moving like a single entity across the broken ground behind the house. Clay's heart nearly stopped as he watched her guide Diablo through a maze of boulders and sagebrush, using the terrain to stay hidden from the attacker's line of sight. What was she thinking? This wasn't a time for heroics. It was a time for survival. Then he understood her strategy. Ella was positioning herself behind the assailants, using Diablo's speed and agility to reach the high ground that overlooked their positions. From there, she could signal their locations to Clay and his defenders, turning the attacker's own flanking tactics against them. "Smart girl," Pete Morrison called out between shots. "She's got them thinking they're being surrounded." The psychological effect was immediate. Professional killers were trained to handle direct confrontations, but the possibility of being caught between defenders created uncertainty that disrupted their tactical planning. Clay could see them shifting position, trying to maintain offensive momentum while protecting their own retreat routes. Sheriff Mills had moved to support Doc Henderson's position, their combined fire keeping 2 of Hutchins' men pinned behind. An overturned water trough, But the real fight was developing between Clay and Hutchins himself, the two leaders engaging in a deadly dance of advance and retreat across the ranch yard. "You can't win this, Barlow," Hutchins shouted from behind the burnt barn timbers. "My company has resources you can't imagine. Kill us, and 10 more will take our place." "Maybe so," Clay replied, reloading with practiced efficiency. "But you won't be alive to spend your blood money." Clay twisted the wedding ring on his finger, a habit he'd developed during his gunfighting years, a reminder of what he was fighting for when violence seemed to consume everything else. He'd worn it. Through every battle, every confrontation, every moment when death felt closer than breath. It had been his anchor to the man he wanted to be, rather than the killer circumstances had made him. Now, as bullets whined overhead and smoke filled the air, Clay found himself thinking about Sarah and Emily, about the family he'd lost and the family he was trying to protect. The ring felt warm against his skin, as if it carried some benediction from the past, some approval for the choices he was making. A movement caught his eye. One of Hutchins' men had broken cover and was sprinting toward the house, probably trying to reach Ella's former position upstairs. Clay's shot caught him center mass, spinning him around and dropping him in the dust. 3 down, 4 to go. From her position on the ridge, Ella raised her arm and pointed toward a cluster of rocks where muzzle flashes revealed another attacker's location. Clay nodded his understanding and began working his way around to get a clear shot, using the knowledge of his own land to stay hidden while closing distance. The man behind the rocks never saw him coming. Clay's bullet found its mark, and suddenly the sound of gunfire began to diminish as Hutchins' surviving men realized their numerical advantage was evaporating. "Hutchins!" Clay called out. "It's over. Surrender now, and I'll let you live to stand." Trial. The answer came in the form of a desperate charge as the thin man broke cover with his 2 remaining companions, all 3 firing rapidly as they rushed Clay's position. But desperation made them careless, and Clay's years of experience guided his response. His first shot dropped the man on the left. His second caught the man on the right in the leg, sending him tumbling. That left only Hutchins, still charging with a revolver in each hand and murder in his eyes. Time seemed to slow, as it always did in moments like these. Clay could see every detail, the sweat on Hutchins's face, the wild determination in his expression, the way his hands shook slightly as he fired. The shots went wide, fear and rage, destroying the accuracy that might have saved his life. Clay's final bullet caught Hutchins dead center, lifting him off his feet and slamming him backward into the dust. The sound of gunfire stopped abruptly, leaving only the ringing echo of violence and the heavy breathing of survivors. Ella guided Diablo down from the ridge, her face pale but determined. She dismounted and ran to Clay, who caught her in an embrace that spoke of relief, gratitude, and the fierce protectiveness of a father who'd nearly lost his daughter. "Are you hurt?" Clay asked, checking her for wounds. "I'm fine. Are you?" Clay looked around at the battlefield his ranch yard had become, at the men who'd come to kill them and failed, at the friends who'd stood with him against professional killers. He was alive. Ella was safe, and justice had been served in the most final way possible. He slipped the wedding ring from his finger and looked at it one last time, thinking of Sarah and Emily and the love that had shaped his life. Then he took Ella's hand and placed the ring in her palm. "This belonged to your new mother," he said quietly. "Someday, when you're ready, you can pass it on to someone who needs its protection." Ella closed her fingers around the ring, understanding instinctively that she was receiving more than jewelry. She was accepting a legacy of love, family, and the willingness to fight for what mattered most. 6 months later, Clay stood in his workshop, putting the finishing touches on a hand-carved wooden sign that would hang above the ranch gate. The letters, deeply etched and filled with dark stain, read "Barlow and Daughter" in bold script that could be seen from the main road. Below the family name, he'd carved a small image of a horse and rider, commemorating the day Ella had proven that some bonds couldn't be broken by violence or fear. The legal adoption had finally been completed 3 weeks earlier, after military. Investigators confirmed that James Washington's death was indeed murder, and that Ella had no other living relatives. The territorial court, influenced by testimony from Sheriff Mills, Doc Henderson, and half the town of Clearwater, had ruled that Clay Barlow was the best placement for the orphaned girl who'd already found her home. "It's beautiful," Ella said, from the workshop doorway, studying his handiwork with the critical eye she'd inherited from her father. "But shouldn't it say Barlow and Daughter Ranch or something more official?" "Sometimes simple is better," Clay replied, testing the smoothness of the carved letters with his fingertips. "Besides, anybody who matters already knows what this place is." The ranch had been rebuilt stronger than before. The new barn stood twice the size of the original, with proper fire safety features and room for the expanded horse operation they'd planned together. Word of Ella's skill with difficult animals had spread throughout the territory, bringing a steady stream of clients who needed help with everything from bronc breaking to therapeutic work with injured horses. Clay watched through the window as Ella worked with their latest project, a nervous mare whose previous owner had used harsh methods that left the animal skittish and unpredictable. But under Ella's patient guidance, the horse was slowly learning to trust human touch again. The transformation reminded Clay of his own journey from bitter isolation to this unexpected second chance at family life. "Mr. Barlow," Ella called out. "Mrs. Patterson is here to see how Sunrise is progressing." Clay set down his carving tools and walked outside to meet Margaret Patterson, a widow from Helena whose prize mare had been considered unrideable after a traumatic accident. Ella had accepted the challenge when every other horseman in the territory had given up, and the results spoke for themselves. "I can hardly believe it," Mrs. Patterson marveled, watching Ella guide the mare through a series of gentle exercises. 3 months ago, Sunrise wouldn't let anyone near her without rearing and striking. "Now look at her. Patience and respect," Ella explained, dismounting to stroke the mare's neck. She needed to learn that not all humans would hurt her. Once she understood that, the rest was just communication. The transformation applied to more than just horses. Clay had discovered that having someone to care for again had awakened parts of his heart he'd thought permanently buried. The house that had once felt like a mausoleum now rang with conversation, laughter, and the 1,000 small sounds that made a building into a home. Sarah's recipe book had emerged from its dusty cupboard, its pages once again consulted for Sunday dinners and special occasions. Emily's room had been respectfully cleared and converted into a proper bedroom for Ella, though they'd kept the silver hairbrush on the dresser as a reminder of the girl who would have loved having an older sister. "Papa," Ella said, using the title that had evolved naturally over the months they'd lived together. "Do you think Mama Sarah and Emily would have liked me?" The question came during one of their evening porch conversations as they watched the sun set behind the mountains that framed their valley. Clay considered his answer carefully, knowing it would matter to her in ways that went beyond simple reassurance. "I think Sarah would have loved your determination and your kindness to animals," he said finally, "and Emily would have admired your courage. She was fearless too, but she would have respected someone who could gentle Diablo the way you did. I wish I could have known them. In a way, you do know them. They're part of what made this place home, part of what drew you here. Family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to love and protect each other, no matter what." The adoption papers were framed and hanging in the parlor now, legal proof of what their hearts had recognized months earlier. But the real symbol of their bond was something more permanent than documents. It was the way they moved through their daily routines with the comfortable rhythm of people who belonged together. Doc Henderson visited regularly, ostensibly to check on their health, but really to satisfy his curiosity about how their unusual family was developing. Sheriff Mills had become something of an uncle figure, teaching Ella about law enforcement and helping Clay understand the changing territory around them. Even Martha from the saloon had appointed herself unofficial grandmother, bringing cookies and advice in equal measure. "The military investigators want to meet with you again next month," Clay told Ella as they prepared to hang the new ranch sign. "They think your father's evidence might help them build cases against other corrupt development companies." "Will testifying be dangerous? Not anymore. Rocky Mountain Development Corporation is finished and most of their associates are either dead or in jail. You'd be helping make sure other families don't go through what yours did." Ella nodded seriously. "Daddy would want me to do it. He believed in justice." They worked together to mount the sign on sturdy posts beside the gate, Clay holding it level, while Ella secured the hardware. When they stepped back to admire their work, the wooden declaration of family identity seemed to capture everything they'd built together. Partnership, respect, and the kind of love that chose to flourish despite loss and hardship. "Barlow and daughter?" Ella read aloud, testing how the words sounded in the evening air. "It has a nice ring to it." "It does indeed," Clay agreed, slipping an arm around her shoulders as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities. Horses to train, land to work, a family legacy to build together. There would be challenges, certainly, and probably more people who questioned their unconventional arrangement, but they'd faced worse than gossip and survived, growing stronger in the process. As they walked back toward the house where yellow lamplight spilled from windows that had once been dark, Clay reflected on the miraculous way life could surprise you. A year ago, he'd been a bitter, isolated man, counting down his days in solitude. Now he was a father again, a partner in a thriving business, and a member of a community that had welcomed his daughter as one of their own. Sometimes the wildest. Horses made the best partners, once you learned to speak their language. Sometimes the most broken hearts could love again, given patience and the right person to trust. And sometimes a cruel dare, spoken in anger and pride, could become the foundation for the kind of family that chose each other across every boundary that society tried to enforce. The sign would weather many seasons, its carved letters growing smoother with wind and rain, but never losing their meaning. Barlow and daughter, a declaration of love that had conquered grief, prejudice, and violence, to create something beautiful and lasting in the harsh beauty of the Montana frontier.